Hello everyone, welcome to Writing Your Research Proposal. My name is Paul Schmidt and I'm manager of the Writing Support Center here at Western, and I teach management communications at the Ivey Business School, and I'll be your host today. So thank you for joining me. I have entitled this talk Writing Your Research Proposal, but in fact I think we should be calling it Strategize Your Research Proposal, because when you craft a research proposal, you are essentially making moves, and there are infinite number of moves you could make, but it's determining now how you're going to strategize writing your thesis or dissertation in the future. So your research proposal is extremely important. I should also add this caveat that I delivered this presentation for Own Your Future a few months ago. So if you attended that talk, you're not going to witness anything new today. So I completely understand if I see a few numbers drop off. But if you hadn't seen that talk before, welcome, and let's get started. So when you are crafting your research proposal, it's extremely important, of course, to communicate your ideas. So clarity, conciseness are paramount. But it's also extremely important to convince. Now, within the realm of graduate school, oftentimes students are decent at communicating. That's not always the case, not always, but often they communicate. But they're not convincing. So this is a persuasive exercise, and you need to convince other people that you have crafted a viable research question and your proposal is worthwhile. That's incredibly important. So think of the word justify. For every section of your research proposal, you should be thinking, how am I justifying? How am I persuading this particular audience? So as I mentioned before, I teach in business, and I do think much of what we talk about in business is extremely transferable to what you do when you're writing in graduate studies. So for example, we often discuss creating a robust audience analysis. So thinking about what are the wants, what are the needs, what is the knowledge base of your particular audience, because you don't write in a social vacuum. You write for other human beings. But sometimes when I read research proposals, I think someone has a good idea, but again, they're not convincing me that it's a particularly good idea. So always be writer focused. But also in business, we do talk about problematizing, and that's something we'll discuss today too. And again, just crafting a convincing argument. Now this section hopefully won't turn you off, but I wanted to be creative and use an analogy here. So please bear with me. This won't last that long. But when I think of writing your research proposal, I do think about channeling your inner extremely young person, so channeling your inner toddler, but also channeling your inner teenager. So think about what the expectations are. What are the goals when someone is a toddler as opposed to someone being a teenager? So when you're a toddler, you're cuddly. Why are you cuddly? Because you want someone to take care of you. You're responsive to words, right? Any words will make you respond to something. So you may coo, so you get that response from someone else. You're passionate towards most stimuli. Whereas as a teenager, right, you essentially want to be left alone. So think about the process when you're writing a research proposal. You want someone to pick it up, right? You want someone to be responsive to words. You may not coo, but you want to use language that's vibrant, that's interesting, that's engaging, so people actually care about what you do. And there should be a level of passion. So that's something we also talk about in business, is logic makes people think, but emotion makes people act. And when you write a research proposal, you want someone to act, right? right? You want them to green light what you are proposing. So there should be an emotional quotient within that realm of logic. So getting back to our teenager, yeah, sometimes teenagers can be a little prickly, sometimes unresponsive to words. They may give monosyllabic grunts, and they're passionate to very few things except maybe a cell phone ringtone. Now, I'm embellishing a little bit, of course. There are some wonderful teenagers out there. I have one right now, and he's very nice. But overall, what do you want? You want people to leave you alone. So this is why you walk this precarious tightrope, because you want your supervisor to, of course, like what you produce, but ultimately you want to be left alone. And that's why the research proposal is extremely important too, because if you do it well, essentially your first 3 chapters of your thesis or dissertation will be taken care of, right? Because you planned it, you strategized accordingly. So when we look at our goals, the goal is to be adored, and the goal in graduate school is to be given some space. You know, you, like a teenager, you should be questioned, or you should question, you should interrogate. You're essentially disrupting the status quo. Today I'll call it problematizing, but essentially you're just disrupting in some way, shape, or form. So you could see gaps that you are going to create a positive response to that gap. But ultimately, I like using the word problem. So goal, you want to be adored, but you also want to interrogate what has happened before, right? Your predecessor's work. So words, you use many and be picked up, right? When you're a toddler, you're going to use a bunch of words and hopefully be picked up, but you don't want to say too much, right? So essentially, there's great power in brevity. So if you write in a rambling manner, then no, your audience will not necessarily be receptive to your message. So you need to write sticky messages, and you need to write with impact. So today I'm not necessarily talking about writing in a concise manner or writing in a clear manner. We have other workshops that delve into those topics. But it is extremely important that you don't say too much also. Your tone should be passionate, but also defensive to a degree. When I mean defensive, you don't want to be defensive when you get, say, feedback from your supervisor. That is not what I mean. But you have to take a defensive approach when you write. You have to anticipate questions, anticipate objections, right? And sometimes that's a difficult way to write, but I think it's a very good way to write. So then you are more writer or audience, I should say, or audience focused. So be defensive to a degree, but also again, be passionate. You need to care about this subject, and more importantly, your audience needs to care about the same subject. And there should be growth, right? There should be growth. So when I think of a good research proposal, I think, if I'm on a committee, if I want to green light this project, right, in the future, I would want someone who's written a proposal that shows certain growth. Like maybe you're impacting positive change in London, Ontario, but maybe it can grow to Ontario or the world or whatnot. And I want to be a part of that growth. Right? I want to be a part of it. But the growth needs to have some limits, and that's where feasibility comes in. So it is about problematizing, but it's also about offering a solution that's feasible. And again, that is a bit of a business approach when you think of it that way. So on the one hand, you're a toddler, but you're also a teenager. Channel both. Ultimately, your work needs to be important. Right? Why is it significant? And that's one thing that I find missing in graduate work often is, what is the significance of this? Why should I care? Again, you care, but that doesn't mean everyone else cares. So it needs to be important, you need to justify it, and it needs to be unique, right? Why is this scarce? Right? How do you differentiate from other houses in your neighborhood? So here's your research community. That's great. Where's your niche? What's your flag that you're planting into that research terrain? And be explicit about these things, right? Be explicit. Use words like important, right? Use words like justify and use words like unique or scarce or whatnot. Because again, it's a persuasive document you're creating. So when we look at problems, and I appreciate that you may not necessarily categorize what you're doing as problematizing, and it does depend on what discipline you're in. But I think you can borrow some aspects from business to what you're creating. So when I talk to startup companies, people who are founders of startups, we often talk about problems, and people care about problems. So if you think with this mindset, then your work will perhaps resonate with other people because people want to solve problems. So good problems are popular, right? This is what I would be talking about with founders of a startup. Some of it may apply to you, some of it may not, but we'll see. So a growing market. We need to see that the market is growing. There is a problem that is evasive. And the same applies to a research proposal. So if this is an issue that is prevalent, then a solution is even more important. So the problem should be urgent too, like it should be solved quickly. Now again, a problem could just simply be, hey, here's the status quo, let's make it better, right? Make it better. But you want to convey some sense of urgency if possible. The problem is expensive, right? So this is very easy in many STEM programs, for example, if you're in medical science or something. But what is the problem? Is it an expensive problem? Is it mandatory? Like, do these problems need to actually be addressed? Is that paramount? And are they frequent? Right? So do people encounter this problem regularly? So if you can showcase even one or two of these aspects here, that's good. That's good. And then it will convey significance to your audience. So questions you should ask when you're formulating your research proposal is, what is the problem? Right? What exactly is happening here? Why do you care? Right? So consider your passion for the particular problem. Why do you care about this? Why are you willing to devote years of your life to solving this issue? Right? And think about, okay, how can I convey that passion without using, say, exclamation marks, but showing that you care in your research proposal. Then number 3, ask, why should I care? So why should I? So you may care about something, but does society care about it the way you do? What is your value proposition? So sorry to use business language, but what do you provide, right? Ultimately, is there going to be a tangible solution to whatever problem you're addressing? And what is it? What do you bring to the table that's special? And then what is your unique selling feature, right? So it could be not just expertise, but maybe it's a certain lab that you could work in, right? Maybe, for example, it's the wind tunnel here at Western. You want access to it, and if you have access to this particular lab, then you could produce something amazing, whatever. But what is your unique selling feature? And then finally, why should I trust you? Because this whole relationship is about trust, right? How can you back up what you say you wish to accomplish? So these are some good questions to ask. And again, they may not be applicable to everyone listening right now, but maybe some of these questions will be. But ultimately, you're asking or answering the question, why? Right? Why are you doing this? And that's where that word justification comes in. It's so incredibly important when you're writing a research proposal. When we break down the different sections of the research proposal, I'm not going to talk about abstracts because I will talk about abstracts tomorrow. But we will look at the other sections of a research proposal. So there's another caveat. We have a title. Right, so here's a title that happens to be my favorite title of all time. Who knew that scientists could also have a sense of humor? I think that's a wonderful title. I'm not suggesting you should replicate or mimic such a title yourself? No. But when you break down an actual title, what are the components? So you want to describe. So for example, barriers to quality daycare providers. Explain what the study type is. So here it's a qualitative study. And then finally, what is the context among lower income families in Ontario? Barriers to quality daycare providers, a qualitative study among lower income families in Ontario. This title will guide the reader, and remember, when you write a research proposal, it's not a suspense novel. Right? People aren't sitting in a bathtub with a glass of wine going, oh, what's on this page 3 or whatever. That isn't what it's about, right? So you want to front load your information as much as possible. So front load just simply means tell us the pertinent information right at the beginning so people are not given a curveball as they continue to read. So it starts right away with the title itself. Then we have the introduction, and the introduction oftentimes is extremely difficult to write because you have to woo the reader. And certain questions like how much context do I need to provide is incredibly important. That's why you need to do that audience analysis. So hopefully you are producing something new. What's the point of a research proposal and research in the future if it's not new? So you're going to have to provide context. And I would say 9 out of 10 times when I work with graduate students, I say to them, you need more context. Don't assume everyone knows what you're saying. Also keep in mind, when you're looking at your audience, when I pose the question, who is your audience to graduate students? They often say, or almost always say, my supervisor, and they would be correct. However, with certain proposals and certain disciplines, you might be writing to the public to a degree, right? Again, if you're in health sciences, you're writing information that the general public would also like to know. So in certain professional programs, there seems to be a secondary and a tertiary audience, and that could be the public in a way. But ultimately, I would say your secondary audience is your most important, and that would be any external reviewers. So get to understanding that you're writing not necessarily for a supervisor, but for an external reviewer from now on. And reviewers just think this reviewer, whoever that may be, won't be privy to the thoughts in your head and certainly won't be privy to your research, right? So you do have to provide a little bit of context, answer those WH questions, the where, the whens, the whats, and then finally get to the whys. But it is important. Also think about positionality. So how do influences from your own life influence how you look at the world? So your worldview, of course, is going to be impacted by your own ideologies. So expressing what those ideologies are depends on the discipline, of course. If you're writing a research proposal in physics, then positionality doesn't matter as much in certain STEM courses. But if we go back to health sciences, it would, because that is a different, you're looking for different goals. And it's also a bit more qualitative and quantitative. But positionality matters immensely in certain programs too. So I'm thinking if you're writing in women's studies, for example, yeah, positionality matters much. So again, how are you influenced? How is your worldview influenced by other social factors? Then you have currency, right? So you want to be as current as possible, of course, when you're writing. And when you're using sources, of course, you're going to have some seminal work maybe written in 1978 for certain courses, but ultimately you want to be as current as possible. Significance, that should be conveyed too. So why is this topical, so currency, why is it important right here and right now? And why is it significant? So it may be current, but not necessarily significant to your gatekeepers in your discourse community. Have you defined your words? So that's about clarity too. When we talk about clarity, it's not just grammar, it's not syntax, that's part of it. But have you provided that context, right? That's part of clarity. Have you defined terms? And some of the terms you may take for granted, thinking, okay, that is a word that's commonly used. But maybe you have a slightly different interpretation of that word, or you're using it in a novel way. So ensure that you're just explicit with your readers, right? You're explaining what exactly is happening. You're guiding them and you're setting them up for not only this research proposal, but your future thesis or dissertation. Is it supported? Right? We work at a research institution, and if no one agrees with what you're saying, then that's problematic. Also, if everyone agrees with what you're saying, that can also be problematic because you want to forward something unique. So is it unique? Right? Again, that needs to be communicated in some way, showing us that this is different from what has taken place before. So you like familiarity. Familiarity is important. That's why you want to follow the proper genre. Right? When you read a research proposal, it should look like a research proposal. That's familiarity. And then you want to disrupt within the familiar, right? Or you're looking at consensus within your research community. This is what people are talking about. However, so in an introduction, you're often framing for common ground, right? You're looking at generalities in your community, and then you're disrupting, right? So that's where the literature review comes in. And here's the literature review. So why do you have to write a literature review? Well, number one, you have to show your breadth of knowledge. Right? It's about garnering trust. Why would I trust an individual who doesn't know what they're talking about? So you're consolidating the existing knowledge, and you're analyzing it. Right? So here it is, I know what I'm talking about. Then you use it to position yourself. You're situating your stance, and you're generating your research questions. As I said before, you don't produce work in a social vacuum. So we have to look at what has been produced, and here's my terrain. And then finally, you're using it to create new research. That's why you're tasked to write a literature review, because you want to avoid duplication. Right? If it's been done before, there's no reason why we need to replicate it. So find your niche and finally justify your study. That's why you write a lit review. When you're producing a lit review, you should be asking these types of questions. So what is being said? So you've got to briefly summarize. You should summarize your work as you go. There are different programs you can use to consolidate that knowledge so it's there, and you're able to summarize. You're able to talk very briefly if asked a question about someone's research. Again, if you're not going to use it in your lit review, then don't bother, but it's a good idea to write it yourself. And I strongly recommend that you don't use AI during this process to summarize your work. I'm seeing this more and more, but writing is thinking. And if you're relying on AI even to summarize some of this information, I know other people would say to you, oh, use it, it's a great tool. And yes, it's a tool and you can use in certain facets of this process. But if you're summarizing a work, it is about consolidating all of that research, but it's also about thinking and your thoughts about that research. And it needs to be meaningful to you. So to articulate that well, I certainly wouldn't rely on a machine to do it for you. Anyway, I'll get off my soapbox. So what does it mean within the field? So these are questions to ask. What does it mean within the field? So explain the relevancy to the discipline. Right? So that's why it's important that you find good work. Right? How is it relevant to the greater dialogue? Because it may be an anomaly, and we'll talk about that in a second. Why does it matter to my research? And that is such an important question that I swear people forget. And when you write a literature review, it's not about them, the other researchers. It's about your research. It's always about your research. And this question needs to be answered within a literature review. So what are you using why are we examining this research? How does that help forward what you are producing? So are there gaps, unanswered questions, or opportunities for further research? Of course, you're looking for gaps in the current literature. But more importantly, do gatekeepers care about these gaps or opportunities? So what problems, contradictions, or uncertainties can be identified within existing arguments, theories, or studies? So yeah, you're looking for different themes, of course. You're looking for similarities and differences within the research. And have these problems been addressed elsewhere? Because again, you don't want to duplicate what's already been said before. If those problems have not been addressed or solved, why not? I think that's a good question, because you're intelligent or you wouldn't be here, but there are also many intelligent people who are at this institution and at other institutions. So why has this problem not been solved? Right? I think it's a very good question. I used to teach in engineering before I taught communications there. Students would write proposals, and that was one of the questions I'd always ask them. Why hasn't this been addressed? Therefore, you should be doing, in business again, a PESTLE analysis, right? So how is this problem solving, say, a technological issue or a political issue or a legal issue or whatever issue it is? But you have to understand the political landscape of your terrain. So it's not always just about some abstract theoretical realm. You want to produce something that will solve a real world problem. That's what's extremely important, especially these days. Getting outside of the theoretical realm and solving a real world problem. But to solve a real world problem, you do have to address some of the political nuances that exist within the world. So maybe these problems haven't been solved because of some financial constraints or political constraints or whatnot. So these are good questions to ask, but think about it holistically, not simply from a theoretical point of view. So why is method X used more commonly than method Y? Right, I think when you're looking for your own uniqueness in your work, perhaps you're looking at methodology, and all these researchers are viewing the work through a specific methodological lens, but you want to approach it from a different one. But why hasn't anyone done that before? So therefore you're thinking in a critical way about your own work and why you may have some obstacles to face. Finally, why has nobody used a combination of both method X and Y or new method Z? Yeah, and again, you're a sleuth, right? You're a problem solver, so here's X, here's Y. Why is nobody amalgamating what's happening here? So again, it's asking those questions, but not only asking those questions, but addressing those questions in your research proposal. So you want to establish your niche, and to do so when you're writing your literature review. And I'm not going to go into full detail, by the way, because we do offer another talk solely on literature reviews, but it is so important when you are writing these research proposals. I need to address it with you. Ways to approach the literature: counterclaiming. So this existing research, however, is misguided because I'd be careful about using the word misguided. So you also want to be collegial with your predecessors, be diplomatic. Then you will show that you are flexible in your thinking. And again, collegial. You're not just lambasting what happened before you, because tone is important. You want to convey that you're confident, but you're also curious and willing to learn. So you're humbly confident because you're working with people potentially who are educators and want to educate you. So you do have to show some humility too, and you can show that through your research proposal. Confident, but humble confidence. So you're indicating a gap. However, there has been little research that ellipses, ... question raising, a question remains whether, whatever. So when you're going through the literature itself, You could use all of the above: counterclaiming, indicating a gap, question raising, or continuing a tradition, right? The differences between X and Y need to be analyzed. Should we continue with this tradition? Other researchers have, but I want to potentially buck that tradition. So just some ways to approach the literature itself. So when you are finding your own research niche, I mentioned methodology. You want to show scarcity. This is what people are doing in another environment. I'm creating something new. How do we show it's new? So we'll go back to methodology. Everyone's doing quantitative. How about qualitative? All right, the topic isn't new, but your methodology is new. Therefore, you've created something unique. It could be frameworks. So let's view this topic through a post-colonial lens. Maybe all researchers in this subject area were men, and you're approaching it through feminist scholarship. This is the lens that you're approaching this work. So therefore, your paper is unique. Maybe data sets. This archival material, it hasn't been analyzed, right? We unearthed this great archival material, let's use it. And finally, context. So maybe they tried this study somewhere else, maybe in, I don't know, Ghana or somewhere, or a Scandinavian country or somewhere. They tried it somewhere else. It's an interesting study. Let's view it through a Canadian context, perhaps. So this is a way you frame uniqueness through frameworks, methodology, data sets, or context. So you're going to know the literature, you got that breadth of knowledge, you have some gaps, but more importantly, I will reiterate, the gap that gatekeepers care about. But that gap could be very small, right? It doesn't have to be a huge gap, but sometimes the smaller gaps can be extremely profound. So the ideation phase, it should be narrow and tight, like dig deep, right? You don't know what creatures exist in the depth. They're interesting, right? You see a fish like this and you're drawn to it rather than looking at a tuna. It's interesting. So you can find exciting discoveries when you do dig deep. And a narrow focus really is what you're doing in university, right? At the beginning of your university experience, you're going to take survey courses, they're general courses, and then when you get your PhD, it's extremely specific. So you should be starting out thinking in a specific manner to show your expertise in a narrow, tight window. The scope is also extremely important. So other researchers have conducted lots and lots of research on your subject, but you're going to communicate the scope of your project in your introduction. That's important. And finally, you also want to look at how your work can grow. We mentioned that at the very beginning, but you have this specific idea. How does it grow and how does it affect people? So you may have these great data sets, but ultimately you want to make change with real human beings. So think in those terms. And is everyone affected in the same manner? Probably not. So think about, and again I'm using a business example, but think about different players in the game. So who are the different stakeholders that you're mentioning here, and how could they be affected? So moving forward, and provide the context again. So what is the context? Very specific. How can it grow globally? So we love the idea. Think about the people reading your work. They are most likely Canadian residents. You're impacting their lives in some way, shape, or form. It may just be incremental or small, but whatever. And then hopefully you're able to expand even globally with your research. So you're impacting people on a human local level and potentially on a global level. That makes for a good research proposal. That's not always the case, of course, it's not always the case, but it's just a good idea to think in these terms. So when you're looking at that literature review, ask, well, here's my research question, because one question I am often asked is, how do you compose the literature review? What order do you put it in? Well, you have your research question. These circles represent different articles. So the larger circle is an article, and then you have a shared topic. Well, so everything you read, of course, would be a shared topic, or you wouldn't explore that article or book or whatever you're reading. But then you've got your methodology. So some may share the same methodology, some may not, some may share the same framework or concept. Then you go to order them to tell your research story, and think in terms of a research story. Because what are your challenges? What are your obstacles? Think about a story itself. You are the hero of your own research story. You're going to encounter some obstacles, of course, right? Because you're making change, and people don't always love change. So you have to convince people that change should happen in this manner. So you go from the furthest from your research, that's how you're ordering it, to your research itself, the closest to your research, to tell that story. So yeah, they all share the same topic, but then eventually maybe it's the methodology component that you're borrowing from a particular article, and that's where you want to end with, because it closely resembles your research, but of course is different. So a lot of times people may put it in a chronological order, and that doesn't always work, right? Because you want to make it thematic. Now, you can put it in a chronological approach, I guess, but it doesn't always work, as I said. The next part is a little racy. I hope you're all older than the restricted age, and anyway, I'm going to show it, but if you are upset about certain things, then you might want to look away, because we're going to talk about sex just for a little bit. Specifically, sex between these two beetles. It's called Largus californicus, and I'm going to just briefly show you how people use lit reviews in regular papers. So, very quickly, this research story that they're trying to convey. The whole topic is about these insects and how do they know with whom to mate. So it's not a research question that most of us really care about, but these researchers do, and bless them, because we need researchers in every sector. So here's the issue. You've got some insects who spring out of the womb and they grow. They enter the earth and they grow. So you've got a little insect, they grow into big insects. But you also have others who spring into the world already fully grown. So the holometabolous insects, they grow. The hemimetabolous insects, sorry, it's not my field, they do not grow over time. So we want to study these insects, but we haven't found much research regarding Largus californicus and their mating habits, which is also good because we want to create something new. So how do we frame it? Well, first we're going to talk about all the researchers that discuss reptiles and birds and fish and how they mate, right? Because that can still help tell a compelling story. Then we're going to go to the holometabolous insects because they are different from the Largus californicus. As I said, they grow over time. Then we talk about the insects that most resemble Largus californicus, and then we talk about Largus californicus. So that's one way to show your research story, but it's not about methodology. It's simply about the species themselves, right? You've got the genus, and this is different, so we're going to get closer to the insect that we want to study. There are many different ways to approach it, but keep in mind, furthest from my research, closest to my research. So when you think about the language that's used in the literature review too, I find it interesting. I like going through them to see how they create doubt. And that's what your job is to do. Right? Here's the status quo, and you want to create doubt. Right? Why do we need doubt? Well, because you're offering hope. That's what a research proposal does, and that's pretty cool. Right? So we're doubting the status quo, but we're providing hope. So when we look at how it's framed. Now this is a literature review really that you'd find in a typical academic journal. When you write yours, you're going to add sections in which you're discussing how you're using this research for your own gain. But I just want to show you that you've encountered literature reviews many, many times, in essence, whenever you read an academic paper, right? So you see at the beginning, almost every paper in your research proposal can look like this too. Other studies have used macroecological patterns and biodiversity ratios in novel ways to improve estimates of the total number of species. In business, we call that framing for common ground. So you begin in a manner in which you're simply explaining the consensus. This is what people are talking about. Then you offer hope. You see words like but, or heated controversy, or predictions, right? Because estimates, predictions, they aren't etched in stone. Only specific groups. Words like only are often used to frame doubt. Remarkably uncertain, significant gap, basic knowledge. Then when you discuss your research, the language morphs into something extremely positive. Here we present a quantitative method, right, which is much more complete, which was much more completely known, strongly correlated, allows the extrapolation. So the language changes from doubt to hope, and that's how the language should change when you write your research proposal. But again, remember, when you write the lit review, it's about your research, always. And also keep in mind that you have to know who the heavy hitters are. So for example, in the NBA, this person, his name is Kawhi Leonard, and we used to care about him because he used to play for the Toronto Raptors. He no longer does. This picture was taken after a very important shot in the playoffs in 2019, and eventually the Raptors won. After the game, the sports journalists, who do you think they flocked to? Kawhi Leonard or his teammate here? His name is Jordan Lloyd. Well, of course they went to Kawhi Leonard because he's an NBA star who just hit that shot. The reason I'm saying this is in the academic world, there are Kawhi Leonards, the all-NBA types, and then there are Jordan Lloyds, the people who never get off the bench. So when you're writing, a lot of you are probably master's students. You haven't written a research proposal before. And at this stage in your academic career, you don't need to know all the Jordan Lloyds, but you absolutely need to know the Kawhi Leonards. So read your professor's work, understand how they would craft an argument, but also read their reference pages to see who they think the heavy hitters are in their field, and rely on some of those sources. Maybe when you're doing your PhD, you're going to have to encounter more Jordan Lloyds. But for now, if you're writing your master's thesis, you don't need to know everybody. Anyway, read the conclusion sections of recent papers, and that will also springboard your own research proposal ideas. Another question I get asked is about references, and references should be placed throughout the entirety of your proposal, not just the lit review, but not in the abstract. So the 5 C's of lit reviews: cite, compare, contrast, critique, finally connect to your own research. Alright, now we're going to switch gears, and I thought a good approach to this talk would be to just come up with a hypothetical research proposal that I might do. And I'm interested in what took place a few years ago, with these freedom fighters in Ottawa. You probably remember all the truckers that went to Ottawa and caused a decent disturbance while they were there. And the idea of populism. So the question I encountered was, does a populist boogeyman exist in Canada? So America is run by populism right now, especially with Donald Trump winning the last election. So I want to ask the question about populism. And I chose a topic that everyone can understand, something that's not entirely esoteric, again, like, say, physics. So in political science, populism is the idea that society is separated into two groups at odds with one another, the pure people and the corrupt elite. Okay, and you see this pervading our society, frankly, where, again, there's very little trust in the corporate elite, in politics, and politicians. So here's my topic. If I'm breaking it down, I wanted to write a research proposal. This is not my area of expertise. I just thought it would be an interesting topic to discuss. And moving forward, how would I approach it? So here's my topic, populism in Canada. So I need a more focused topic, of course. So populism's effect on politics. Okay, we still need to make it more focused, populism's effect on Canadian politics. And more focused topic, populism's effect on Canadian voter trust. That's what I want to discuss. However, the Canadian context might be too wide of scope, so I'll focus it even more, populism's effect on Ontario's voters' trust. So that added layer of context to make my proposal unique. So I have something to say, but I need to support it, of course. So my experiences plus theory, right? That's important, of course. You're in graduate school, you understand the importance of theory. But a theory is a system of constructs, concepts, and propositions, so relationships between those constructs that collectively, and that's important, right? So it's collectively, by scholars have consolidated it, considered this a particular worldview, present a logical, systematic, and coherent explanation of a phenomenon of interest within some assumptions and boundary conditions. Okay, so I need the theory to undergird my own experience and thinking. So I came up, did some research, and I found trust theory. So we're looking at political trust, makes sense. Let's look at trust theory. Trust theory is a framework that explains how people form and evaluate trust in different situations and contexts. Alright, that can help me with my proposal. I also found social capital theory. So social capital theory argues that generalized social trust is an important and central theme in a complex and virtuous circle of social attitudes, behavior, and institutions that act as the foundation for stable and effective democratic government. Okay, so we've got trust theory and then this social capital theory. So it's generalized social trust in a complex and virtuous circle of social attitudes. Okay, so essentially, do people trust institutions, and why or why not, and what goes into that line of thinking? Okay, I think I could use it. Then I do more research. A smaller body of work, however, finds a robust association between social and political trust. Okay, so that theory could work for me because I want to delve within political trust, not just social trust. Okay, that works. These results suggest that social and political trust may indeed be closely linked after all, as social capital theory claims. Excuse me. Alright, this works. I have some theory that I could use to undergird my work. Now keep in mind that you don't want to use many theories. This is a problem I see in many proposals. People are discussing 4 different theories, thinking that will make me look really smart if I have so many theories. You can overdo it, and it becomes too complex and unmanageable. So for now, with your research proposal, just think, okay, I've got this main theory, I can use maybe 2 theories, but don't go overboard. Then I have to think about my aims and objectives, right? So when you're writing this research proposal, what are my aims, what are my objectives? So essentially, aims provide the overall direction for the research. So this is where I want to go, while objectives provide specific targets that must be achieved to accomplish the aims. So aims provide a broad context for the research, while the objectives provide smaller steps that the researcher must take to accomplish the overall research goals. So overarching goal is your aim. So So how do I get there is your objective. So you can think about, I don't know, someone who wants to transfer from the University of Waterloo to Western. I shouldn't have to explain why anyone would do that. You just inherently know. So we want to go from Waterloo to Western. That's our aim, to get to Western. Now, how are we going to get there? Well, we could take this route down Highway 8, or we could take the 401. Why would you take 8 versus 401 or vice versa? Explain. Validate your choices. So your objective is, how are you going to get there? What choices are you going to make to arrive at your aim, your destination? And these aims, so your broader goals, your objective, your path to get there, and your research question that you devise, putting your aim into action, must align, right? They must align. And if your research proposal feels a little redundant, a little repetitive, that's okay. There will be a little bit of repetition because you want to explain what your aims are, your objections, and your question. They need to align. They should be very similar. So if I go back to my research proposal, I'm going to look at my aims, right? So to explore how in Ontario, election populist rhetoric has changed since the onset of COVID and how changes have impacted Ontario voter trust. That's really what I want to explore. But I have to ask myself the question, why am I doing this? Well, because divisiveness breeds unrest and impacts elections and our democracy. So our democracy is essentially impacted by words that are used. So objectives. The objectives should follow the SMART principle, right? Are they specific objectives? Can we measure them? Are they actually achievable? So again, feasibility. Are they realistic, right? And are they timely? So what do I want to do? I want to identify how prevalent populist rhetoric has become in Ontario since the pandemic by analyzing campaign speeches. I also want to collect data to examine this rhetoric's impact on Ontario voter trust and disseminate the findings. So that's something tangible I want to accomplish. And I'm collecting the data so other people can view it. I'm going to examine it and disseminate my findings. But I'm going to do so within a SMART framework. Then what is my lens? Well, I'm going to use trust theory, as I showed you before, and I'm going to explore through social capital theory. Those are my frameworks that I want to use to show that I'm a credible resource. Then my methodology we'll discuss in a second, but overall it's going to be qualitative. But that can also change. Think about your research proposal not being etched in stone. Maybe you go into it thinking, I'm doing a qualitative study. It can change. Maybe it'll change to a mixed methods approach as you feel the need arises. But for now, I'm just going to say it's a qualitative study. My methods, I'm going to use discourse analysis. And I'm not going to delve too deeply into the discourse analysis. That can wait to when I say write my dissertation. But, because there are different nuances to discourse analysis. But I'm just going to say it's a discourse analysis for now. But the more specific you make your research proposal, the easier your thesis or dissertation will be. So strategize now, and then again, it's so much easier. So surveys I'm going to use, interviews, okay. I'll go into detail, not today, but who am I going to survey, who am I going to interview. My implications, so what are the implications of the study? It helps change social media platforms. Oh, hello? Yeah.
One of our MPs was just looking for the QVivic. I'm always like,
hello?
I'm like, QVivic.
I'm telling you, like,
I want to say
hey, Rachel?
I want to say QVivic.
Yeah.
But it's like
Rachel?
Right.
I know.
Say the Q first.
I know.
Could you mute, please?
Yeah, QVivic.
Excuse me?
Yeah, I know, that's the problem, right? So people can't remember it. I'm like,
Hello?
I don't know if this knows, but I'm like, it came out about 3 or 4 years ago in Sweden, so that's
I'm
where
sorry, everyone.
I discovered, yeah, the company.
If you click Rachel,
So I just
Hello?
said,
Stream,
yeah.
you should be able to.
Fancy, it's a fancier piano.
It's the
Sorry.
mirror.
Yeah. So, but I
I'm
don't
gonna
know.
go and try
But
and
anyway.
Yeah, so that's what
good
we're
though.
looking
So
for,
you guys,
yeah.
Try and use
I had dropped them off a while ago.
Okay, thank you. All right. Sorry about that, everyone. So methodology. So I see Rachel's riveted to what I'm discussing. That's excellent. Okay, so methodology, methods, the implications. So what will change essentially due to my research? I also need to discuss the time period and justify why this time period. So 2019 to 23, I want to focus on electoral rhetoric. I'm going to examine it using discourse analysis pre and post COVID-19 and limitations. So what are my limitations in the study? Data collection will be difficult, right? How am I going to find some of this information? So I need to have reasonable goals throughout, right? They need to be feasible. To use an analogy, I remember when my son was going into grade 9 and he ran track, and he said his goal was to run a 10.14 100-meter dash, which is essentially what Andre DeGrasse, an Olympian sprinter for Canada, runs. So yeah, I didn't want to quash my son's dreams, but internally I was thinking, I don't think that's happening, son. You have my DNA, and it's just not going to work out for you. But all the best. All right, so have reasonable goals. You need to be introspective about what you can accomplish during this amount of time whenever you're writing, say, your dissertation. And you have to think, what do I need to get there? You're going to need money, time, and perhaps participants in a study. That's why you need contingencies too. Another business aspect is whenever you're proposing something, you need contingencies because things don't work out, right? They rarely work out how you plan. So what is your contingency? Maybe you could get by with less money, less time, and fewer participants. But you have to think about some of these problems, anticipate the problem itself, and then address it potentially in your research proposal. Like a what-if scenario. If you can't get this funding, well, perhaps you could try something else, a different version of what you're proposing. Okay, so I thought about all that. I have my research questions, and I've come up with how has populist rhetoric impacted public trust in Ontario's provincial electoral process? And my second question would be, how has COVID-19 exacerbated the issue? So I think these are viable questions that I could ask, and yeah, I could write a thesis answering these questions for sure. But I also have to think about my research design. You don't have to go into the nuances of the design, but you have to understand where you're going with the project. Ultimately, again, as I mentioned, the more you have this figured out, the easier it will be to write your thesis or dissertation. Overarching, what's your philosophy? Are you using an interpretivist approach where you're looking at the subjective nature of knowledge, or are you looking at it more empirically with a positive approach? Right? Is it more deductive or inductive? So are you taking, a set of empirical observations and then building from that, or are you being inductive, looking at a theory first and then finding information that fits the theory? So you have to think about your overall philosophy, your methodology, of course, your sampling, right? So if you want a study with high generalizability, for example, where you can generalize this information, maybe a case study wouldn't work for you. But this is why you take research design courses, of course, and you should dialogue with your supervisor about your design, right? Because it can get very tricky. So your data, what form, how are you going to collect the method, right? Should it be a survey, interviews, whatnot? Finally, your analysis. Is it going to be more empirical, more quantitative with a regression analysis, or are you going to use a thematic analysis and more qualitative approach? So if I'm looking at my approaches here, I'd probably look at an interpretivist approach, qualitative approach, right? And I'm going to use focus groups, maybe your interviews or whatnot, and a thematic analysis. So So you got your plan, your research strategy, your methodology, and you're going to explain why. Always explain, justify why you made these choices, because your predecessors maybe chose other choices, right? So explain why you're different, or why you're adopting their same strategy. And then you have your methods, right? The tools to implement the strategy, right? So overarching methodology, your research design, and then the tools, like say a case study or whatnot, to make it happen. So the proposal must be capable of convincing the evaluation committee about the credibility, achievability, practicality, and reproducibility of the research design. So if I wanted to do your study, would it be replicable, right? And why should I trust you? Right? Is it feasible? Can it be done? And why should I trust that you can carry it out? Right? That's why your research proposal, and a well-crafted one where you strategize and show the future, right? You're making the unpredictable predictable as much as possible, then I'm going to buy into it more. So for my study, I'll use discourse analysis of campaign speeches, interviews, and surveys, and then I have to think about the potential impact of this study. Does it have commercial potential? May inform policy and legislature. Might offer new perspectives, right? So what do you fit? How do you categorize the outcome, the tangible deliverables of your research study? And then you're concluding, right? You should have a significant sandwich at the beginning of this research proposal. Show me how it's significant, and at the end, show me how it's significant. So why the study should be done. In your conclusion, reiterate why it should be done. Overall purpose of the study again. Not using necessarily the same language, but just an overall summation of what you discussed. Why you chose your research design, again, briefly. Your potential implications, and then fit within scholarship. So you're going to reiterate some of these points to show the significance and why we should listen to what you have to say. You also need the practicalities. Right? So what's your project plan? This is the more pragmatic information that needs to be conveyed, right? So what's your budget? Can you actually produce within the fiscal restraints that you're under? Can you produce what you need to produce? What are those contingencies again? So A may not work, but we can go to B if need be. Ethical compliance, of course. Appendices. So that's information, not just junk in the trunk, but information that you think isn't extremely pertinent to everyone reading this proposal, but some may be interested. You know, it could be some data sets or whatnot that aren't crucial to what you're discussing, but it's maybe some points of interest for your readers. And finally, your reference page, of course. All right, so now hopefully you're equipped with some understanding of your research proposal, and I will just pander to you with a cute child again. So good luck with your proposal. Channel your inner toddler, but also your inner teenager, and come and see us at the Writing Support Center. So hopefully you can glean some good information from this talk, but we can diagnose your own specific writing issues when you come to us and can really help. So I strongly advise that you book appointments with our writing advisors so we can help you create the most persuasive proposal that you can write. I would also add that we help with presentations too, so that's something to consider when you think of the Writing Center. We do more than simply writing. So it's academic writing, professional writing, but also presentations. So I will stop sharing my screen. I'm a horrible multitasker, so if you have any questions and you did want to put them in chat, I'd be happy to stick around. But if you want to unmute too, I'd certainly be glad to have human contact. That would be great too. So
Hi, Paul.
you're welcome. Thank you so much for attending. I greatly appreciate all the people who attended today.
Hi, Paul. This is Gina DeVoe. I do have a quick question for you
Sure.
before you sign out. Thanks so much for this. It was extremely helpful. I'm just wondering whether or not there is, I know that the slides are not available through these seminars, but I'm just wondering whether or not you have a concise outline of this information that you'd be willing to share.
Sure, yeah, I could provide something, or certainly some slides that are informative. Sure, Gina. Yeah.
I'm happy to send you an email just so that...
Please, yeah, please send
Thank
me.
you. Thank
You're
you very
welcome.
much. Thanks, everyone.
Anyone else have a question? No?
Hi, I can ask a question.
Sure.
So I'm doing an English master's proposal, and I'm wondering about the breadth versus the depth of knowledge in a proposal specifically, because it can get a little sticky, right? Like, it's hard to summarize, and then, yeah, that's my question.
Oh, okay. Without further context, that's a very difficult question
Okay.
to ask, I would argue. But I would say, again, it can morph. Like the research proposal, as I said, is not etched in stone. So if you do make it specific and you get the green light, it is possible to expand what you're discussing, or say your thesis, right? It doesn't have to be, okay, I've written it now, this is my topic, this is my methodology. You're just getting your foot in the door, essentially. So do keep that in mind. I would argue the more specific you make something, the better. But then, of course, you fall into the pitfalls of research and finding more information about the topic itself. So, yeah, it's difficult in English literature. That it can get difficult when you're talking about the breadth of the question itself. Is that what you're asking?
Well, I think for like the literature review and even just the scope of the whole thing, yeah, I think the whole thing maybe.
Because when I think of English literature, I do think the context matters so much. You could be, deconstructing a poem versus, looking at the canon in a feminist lens of, this particular genre or something.
Yeah,
Right?
so for me right now,
Incredibly expansive.
I'm constrained to 3 novels, and I'm looking at a time period and a trans theory lens for it. So those are the things I'm incorporating.
Okay. Well, think about, you want to convey uniqueness. So when we look at trans studies, how is trans studies used perhaps even in other disciplines, right? So you want to show that what you're doing is unique. And, how prevalent is looking at English literature through a trans lens? How prevalent has it been to date? Is a good question. So you're going to have to look at and have that breadth of knowledge and think about other studies that have been conducted and maybe how it's applicable to these 3 works of literature. But, there are different approaches you can take. But again, the importance is to sell, right? You're asking why your research makes the reader protrude their lip, right? Go,
Yeah.
I'm learning something here. And why? Well, in this case, perhaps it's the lens that you're approaching. Like maybe you're disrupting the canon through a trans lens, and that is interesting, that is engaging, and that is a selling feat. right? That's your value proposition, or your unique selling feature for your research. So yeah, as far as the breadth of knowledge, I'd have to see your research, frankly, to be honest, to answer it specifically, and what stage you're at, what iteration of your research you're at. But yeah, I hope I've kind of answered your question, but it's
Yes, I think
don't-
so. I think English is weird because you try to show off like using a lot of language. Like simplification is like really taboo in English, but then it's like, how do I sound smart, compress a bunch of information, right? I think that's more like the issue, the style almost.
Well, my undergrad in English, or I had an undergrad in English, I remember writing the somnambulistic sleepwalker pontificate.
Yeah.
And it was horrible, absolutely horrible. So it's, because what sleepwalker is going to be pontificating, right? And what does somnambulism mean? Sleepwalking. So it was a horrible construction, but I really wanted to write to impress. I should be writing to express.
Okay.
I totally understand where you're coming from with English literature, for sure. But again, it is a matter of what's really important is less so the stylistic concerns and just having a cogent argument that helps move research forward.
Okay.
And so you don't have to know everything about, every trans study that's been done, but maybe just focusing a little bit on, why this is so important, right? Why is it so important to disrupt?
Thank you. Yes, that helps a lot. Thank you so much for all of that.
Okay, Jen, take care.
You too.